Deadly Delusions. Europe's deradicalization programs. It was a tragedy of good intentions. Jack Merritt died in the London Bridge attack. Don't forget what he stood for. Emma Goldberg wrote in the New York Times, Merritt was one of two victims of Usman Khan, an Islamic terrorist who struck on London Bridge on November 29th. The other victim was Saskia Jones, a student at the conference targeted by the jihadist. They both dreamed of working to save and protect their murderer. London had been hosting the 5th anniversary of Learning Together, an event in which prisoners, staff members, students, and criminology experts came from all over the country to celebrate the success of their initiative to de-radicalize jihadists. So we're here celebrating a great success. This is equivalent to George Bush standing on that aircraft hangar with a banner behind him saying mission accomplished, right? Mission accomplished, and we're 20 years into this war. Khan, the jihadist, had been present as a role model of the recovery program. So they're celebrating this recovery, right? They transformed him from a jihadist into a productive member of society, right? In 2012, Khan was sentenced to prison for plotting to blow up first the London Stock Exchange, then London Mayor, at the time, Boris Johnson, and then the London Eye Ferris wheel. So he's motivated. Learning Together used Khan as a, quote, case study on how reintegration programs in society work. He had even written a poem and notes of thanks to the organizers. So this guy was the poster child for this recovery program to de-radicalize jihadists in UK. At this event, he stabbed one of the organizers and someone who had worked closely with him in this recovery program. Okay? So your poster child murdered you despite your best efforts to de-radicalize him. So let's talk about jihad a bit. Let's talk about, we'll put it in context, okay? There's a word called Taqiyya, which means if my intentions are good, which undoubtedly they are because I am serving Allah, it doesn't matter what I do to accomplish that end. The end justifies the means. Okay, so there are a couple of words that have similar meanings. The Hadith makes it clear that Muslims are allowed to lie to non-believers in order to defeat them or to protect themselves. There are several forms. Taqiyya, saying something that isn't true as it relates to the Muslim identity. This is a Sunni term, or Shiite term, I'm sorry. The Sunni counterpart is mudarat. Kitman, lying by omission. This is a media favorite. An example would be when a Muslim apologist, quote, only a fragment of a verse, say 5:32, that if anyone kills, quote, it shall be as if he had killed all mankind, end quote, while neglecting to mention that the rest of the verse and the next mandate murder in undefined cases of corruption and mischief. Tawriya, intentionally creating a false impression. Muruna, blending in by setting aside some practices of Islam or Sharia in order to advance others. We have a Muslim congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, who is willing to set aside the prescriptions of Quran and Hadith with regard to marriage, right? She is willing to set aside some of those things in order to advance other aims of what you could say the aim for a global caliphate. Though not called Taqiyya by name, Muhammad clearly used deception when he signed a 10-year treaty with the Meccans, known as Hudaybiyah, which allowed him access to their city while he secretly prepared his own forces to take over. The unsuspecting residents were conquered in easy fashion after he broke the treaty 2 years later. Some of the people in the city who had trusted him at his word were executed. Okay, so you play the victim, you get in, you become entrenched, and then you take over. That wouldn't happen today. Let's define jihad. This is Encyclopedia Britannica. Jihad, Islam. This is written by Asma Afsaruddin. Jihad, Arabic, quote, struggle or effort. also spelled jihad. In Islam, a meritorious struggle or effort, the exact meaning of the word jihad depends on context, and it has been erroneously translated in the West as holy war. I can't imagine why. Jihad, particularly in the religious and ethical realm, primarily refers to the human struggle to promote what is right and to prevent what is wrong. Okay, what is right is Allah's will as prescribed by Quran, and the implementation of that will as described in Hadith, the example of the Prophet, for example. So it is not a misinterpretation to call this holy war. It is a struggle against primarily Western culture. Anything that is not Islam, you are kafir, you are apostate, right? So you are subjects. In the same way that in Jewish texts, non-believers, non-Jews are referred to as goyim. It's a similar word to kafir or apostate. An apostate, though, is someone who has broken from the religion, a non-believer. So this is from the religionofpeace.com. This attack, the most recent one in the United States would have been Pensacola, Florida, not far from where we live. Saudi nationals shot 3 students at a naval air station. So he was there learning aviation, similar to, you may recall there was something happened. Some people did something September 11th, 2001. I think I was a sophomore in high school. I saw some people do something on a television station. I would later find out that those were aviation students here from a predominantly Muslim nation. This particular attack, if we scroll down here through all of these attacks, 2019, November 29th, radical Muslim, this is the man I mentioned at the beginning, who was there as an example of reform, stabs 2 young people to death on the London Bridge, 1 woman and the other a graduate student. Okay, so they were there to help. They didn't assess the scene, verify the scene was safe before they entered the scene, and that's how you get killed, paramedics. What does this mean for the West? Okay, so this took place in London. The other attack I mentioned took place in the United States. As you can see from this list, and this is just the last 30 days, right? I'm still scrolling. Okay? This is just the last 30 days. Hundreds of attacks. 97 Islamic attacks in 23 countries in which 461 people were killed and 493 injured. We should try and import this so that it's not taking place in Benashik and Mogadishu and Turpul and Azizia. We want it in St. Louis and Chicago and San Francisco and New York. The West. So the perception in the West as, it's probably unfair that I'm using Cosmopolitan as a source here, but I was looking for baby names. I recall reading an article a few days ago, I believe. Muhammad became the 10th most popular baby name for boys in the United States. It was number 40 in UK in 1994, and today I believe is number 1. The most common baby name in London is Muhammad. London, UK, London. So the perception here, Cosmopolitan's perception, these are going to be the top boys' names for 2020. Austin, Alva, Acacius, Tate, Diego, Easton, Lucius, Cash, Ash, Luca. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. There's already a top 10, and it fluctuates very little from one year to the next. And there is a general upward trend in one specific name. Muhammad, Aliyah, among top 10 most popular baby names in U.S. An estimated 150 million men and boys around the world share the name Muhammad and its variations, making it the world's most common name. So I talked about in an earlier video last week, the predominance of Islam and the 1.8 billion Muslims on the planet. Granted, the overwhelming majority, I'll throw a number out and say 99%, are not committing acts of terrorism. But those who condone it, those who support it, those who believe that Sharia should be the law of the land are in the overwhelming majority in all of these nations. So that becomes a problem for the West. Let's talk about demographics. The total fertility rate in the United States in 2018 by ethnicity of the mother and births per 1,000 women. So, over here to the right, the lowest fertility rate per 1,000 women among Asians. Next would be white, non-Hispanic, followed by American, Indian, and Alaska Native. So they're approximately the same. Blacks a little bit higher, Hispanics a little bit higher, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander a little bit higher. So this doesn't break it down by religion. It's difficult to find data that breaks things down by religion because it's self-reported, it's subjective, whereas race is still subjective but a little more objective. When we talk about race in common language using the vulgar tongue, typically what people mean is nation of origin or skin color, more simply. It's not exact, but that's generally what people mean. So what we're going to see here, take note of the trend here. It's a downward trend toward Asian, white, etc., with Hispanic, black being on the opposite end. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are doing work. Well done, guys. Okay. Median household income in the United States in 2018 by race or ethnic group in U.S. dollars. Okay, note that trend from black to Asian on the last chart. This trend is now reversed. Okay, so we're looking at income, median household income. So those with the highest fertility rate in the United States, black Americans, second only to Pacific Islanders, which are not mentioned here, have the lowest median income per household. Next Hispanic, next Caucasian, and the Asians doing work. Well done, guys. Thanks for being here. The total fertility rate, this is from CNN, in the United States in 2017 continued to dip below what is needed for the population to replace itself, according to a new report from the National Center for Health Statistics. The new report also reveals some major state-by-state differences in fertility rates. So I'm not too much interested in these state-by-state fertility rates, but you can see this chart. If you're interested in this, again, CNN.com, U.S. fertility rate replacement. A 60-page review of the scientific evidence, some based on state-of-the-art magnetic resonance imaging of brain size, has concluded that race differences in IQ are largely genetic. Okay, where is this going, right? The Hart-Celler Act, which I will get to here briefly, changed the nation of origin for the United States. The 1924 law established a quota system based on national origins. It directed nearly 70% of the immigration slots to Northern Europeans, cutting back drastically on immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. It maintained formidable barriers against immigration from Asia and Africa while leaving immigration in the Western Hemisphere unrestricted. Practical sponsors, yada, 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 once immigrants had been naturalized, yada, yada, yada. Quote, the 1965 immigration law quickly transformed the ethnic portrait of the United States, end quote. At first, the new immigration came largely from Southern Europe, especially Italy, but that stream played out in a decade. Meanwhile, immigration from Eastern Europe was limited by repressive communist governments. By 1980, most immigrants were coming from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, in numbers far greater than the annual average of 300,000 that had prevailed during the 1960s. So the limits were lifted and the restrictions were lifted. And immigration shifted from Northern Europe eventually to Africa and Southeast Asia. Okay. So, if we are getting more people from the third world, let's say, it's going to change not only the demographic, it's going to change our politics, it's going to change our economics, it's going to change our culture, it's going to change everything, right? So, here's a pretty easy to understand chart. Comparisons of IQ scores between races in the U.S. suggest a four-way clustering of scores as pictured above. Each racial subgroup appears to present a different distribution with significant overlap. The black-white gap in IQ scores has been persistent over time and across geographical space. Richard Nisbet and James Flynn have tried to make the claim that heritable aspect of IQ is insignificant and that black-white gaps in IQ scores can be eliminated using educational interventions. Neither researcher has been able to make that argument without using a bit of sleight of hand with the data. In the end, the proof is in the scores. If you claim to be able to erase the gap, you should certainly prove your claim. It would be a vast benefit to mankind if the persistent gap could be erased by something as simple as better education. The evidence over time suggests otherwise, and something more will be needed. Okay, quickly. Here's the study that they're citing. This is the most comprehensive IQ study done to date. Psychology, Public Policy, and Law, 2005, volume 11, number 2, pages 235 to 294. This is from the American Psychological Association, copyright 2005. 30 years of research on race differences in cognitive ability by J-Philippe Rushton at the University of Western Ontario and Arthur R. Jensen at the University of California, Berkeley. Briefly, and I'm not going to go into this whole study, you can read it if you like. The culture only, 0% genetic, 100% environmental, and the hereditarian, 50% genetic, 50% environmental models. So briefly, I think you get this, but some people argue that your environment shapes your intelligence. Some people argue that your genes shape your intelligence. It's a mix of both, and the argument is whether one overpowers the other, which one is more significant, which one has greater weight in determining cognition. These models of the causes of mean black-white differences in cognitive ability are compared and contrasted across 10 categories of evidence. The worldwide distribution of test scores, G-factor of mental ability, heritability, brain size, and cognitive ability, transracial adoption, racial admixture, regression, related life history traits, human origins research, and hypothesized environmental variables. The new evidence reviewed here points to some genetic component in the black-white differences in mean IQ. The implication for public policy is that the discrimination model, i.e., black-white differences in socially valued outcomes, will be equal, barring discrimination. What does that mean? Okay, we expect equal outcome unless there is oppression, unless there is systemic oppression or outside factors that are influencing and depressing the black population while elevating the white population. So absent that, these differences must be tempered by a distributional model, i.e. black-white outcomes reflect underlying group characteristics. So if we fail to include underlying group characteristics and we say that all differences in outcome are the result of oppression, we are not going to be able to fix the problem because we're going to be going after oppression, and oppression is not the sole cause. It may be a cause, but it is not the sole cause. And we are ignoring data. We are ignoring facts when we do this. Let's have a look here. So these three charts are going to show IQ distributions, poverty distributions, and birth rates. So the lowest IQ are going to be in red. The highest IQ are going to be in this sort of purple color with a gradient in between from red to purple. So you can see high clusters. Sub-Saharan Africa is really struggling in terms of IQ. The more developed Western nations, Northern Europe, where we once had the majority of our immigration coming from, you see 98, 98, 98, 99, 100, etc. Not far off from the 98 we see here in the United States. Immigration from Canada is not going to be much of an issue. Immigration from South America is not going to be much of an issue. Central America is a little lower. Those people are going to have some difficulty making upward movement in terms of socioeconomic status as a result of this IQ. Central Europe, the Middle East, all pretty low. So, I mean, 84 versus an average of about 100. You can have a difficult time assimilating. So, lowest IQ cluster here, and this is where the Hart-Celler Act shifted our immigration nation of origin to. So let's go down here. Nations with the highest birth rate, and the sources there, you can see them right across the top. So the Rushton-Jensen studies cited here, along with these PISA scores and stuff. I shared that, I believe, on Instagram last week. So the nations with the highest birth rate here, again, so the same cluster you see in IQ, the lowest IQ nations have the highest birth rates, right, with the lowest birth rates being in the highest IQ nations. So IQ and birth rate are inversely correlated. Here's a distribution of poverty, the list of countries by percentage of population living in poverty. Yellow, 20%, red, 40%, brick, 60%, dark brick, 80%, black, 100%. So again, the most impoverished nations also have the lowest IQ and the highest birth rates. There is correlation here. Clearly it is not causal. I don't really want to have that discussion. I'm just saying this is a factor, and it's not something that we can ignore if we mean to minimize suffering globally. Okay. immigrants generally vote left, right? So the more immigrants we take in from the third world, developing nations, etc., the more voters we have voting for socialist, communist policies, redistributive policies, and those redistributive policies adversely affect and directly impact the middle class. And so we'll get into a little bit the shrinking of the middle class here, and the potential implications of this over the long term. So Europe is going to be a test case. Right now we see riots in Brussels, we see riots in France, we see developing riots in South America. So this is taking place all across the world, and it's the direct result of government policies that are forcing people who are unwilling, unable sometimes to assimilate to the culture, unable to find jobs, unable to become productive members of society, and the increasing burden for the provision of housing, food, welfare, sustenance, etc., is falling upon the middle class, and the middle class is shrinking in terms of income and quality of life, let's say, as a result of that. So middle class incomes are being depressed. It's increasing that wage gap that our boy Bernie Sanders is always talking about, so that there are people who are extremely wealthy by comparison, and the middle income earners are being depressed into the lower tiers as a result of taxation. More and more of their income being taken and redistributed by the government to the bottom, right? The 10%, 20% of people who are unable to care for themselves. There's a need to care for those people, obviously. I'm not a complete cyborg when it comes to understanding reality and the need to help people. I'm just saying we can't ignore reality when we're talking about this. Okay. America's shrinking middle class, a close look at changes within metropolitan areas. This chart's pretty easy to understand. 160 metropolitan areas are increase in share that are lower income, 172 metropolitan areas with an increase in share that are upper income, 203 metropolitan areas with a decrease in share that are middle income. So both the upper income and lower income are increasing, and income does include socialized benefits, welfare, health care, housing, etc., with the middle income bracket shrinking. So this is a real problem. They give two examples here, Goldsboro, North Carolina, and Midland, Texas. You see the middle class shrinking, the upper class more or less staying the same, slight downward trend in Goldsboro, and a upward trend in Midland, Texas, with an inverse trend in the lower class here between the two. So the middle class, American middle class, is losing ground in metropolitan areas across the country, affecting communities from Boston to Seattle, Dallas to Milwaukee. 2014 share of adults living in middle class income households fell in 203 of the 229 U.S. metropolitan areas, examined in a new Pew Research Center analysis. So this is from Pew. You can search this headline here, shrinking middle class, metropolitan areas, and you'll see that what I'm talking about is not fantasy. These aren't the delusional ravings of a madman, though they are to a degree. I'm basing these opinions on reality. So the middle class is shrinking, and an ever-increasing burden to care for the lower class is piled up on the shoulders of the middle class. Okay, United States government debt. Government debt in the United States increased to $23 trillion in November from $23 trillion in October. Okay, so there's a marginal difference here, a few $100 million, right? No big deal. But if you look at the general trend on this chart, let's look at some key values here. So this is at its maximum here. I can't go any further back than about 1940. So this is post-war, right? 1950, we're humming along pretty flat in terms of debt, right? We were repaying our debt, public debt specifically. Okay, so we came off the gold standard for the first time in 1913 with the establishment of the Federal Reserve Banking Act. This enabled us to go into war, the First World War, and to finance that war with bankers, with loans. So interest-bearing debt allowed us to go into the First World War. It also allowed us to go into the Second World War, which took place before 1950, but we weren't entirely off the gold standard. So you could only print so much without causing a hyperinflation in your currency and a collapse of your economy. So through the 1930s, we came a little bit further off the gold standard. Then in 1960s, as I mentioned, the repeal of that Hart-Celler Act, we shifted immigration from high IQ nations to low IQ nations. That's an overly simplistic way to put it, but it's true. So we started taking in more low IQ immigrants than high IQ immigrants, or immigrants who matched our level of intelligence for the most part. Cultures were slightly different, and as you saw, gangs of New York, all that stuff took place in the turn of the century, all that. So cultural differences, yes. IQ differences, minimal. So as we increase these IQ differences, we start spending, right? The government has to provide services, provide welfare, provide housing, food, etc. for these low IQ immigrants who are coming in and who are unable to compete in Western economies. Okay, that was 1971, so somewhere about here, Nixon took us completely off the gold standards as temporary measure, right? So what does that mean? Your currency is no longer backed by anything. It's just fantasy, floating fiat fantasy, created in a ledger by bankers and lent at interest to the Treasury. So this is debt being piled up on your back, the middle class, income earners, wage earners, etc. 1971 that took place. So we switched immigration, came off the gold standard, and then you see what happens to the general trend in debt, right? We're now hopefully toward the end of the longest war in U.S. history. This was the financial crash. The Fed spent again, financed with debt a recovery of the stock market, the housing market, etc. So the price of your house should have completely tanked here and corrected back to a level that Americans were able to afford. So if we had a general upward trend in debt, slightly upward trend in debt, somewhere around $50 million, $500 million, let's say, to be conservative. And that's sustainable. For a nation with our GDP, that's sustainable. But it's not sustainable if we continually import people that are going to be increasingly dependent on the government. Okay. A closer look at who does and doesn't pay U.S. income tax. All right. So the Affordable Care Act, yada, 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 all this stuff. We're spending a ton of money. Who is paying for this debt? Who is paying the interest on this debt? We don't know where the interest payments go. We know that the Federal Reserve is a private bank, but it's impossible to find out who owns it. You can find out for yourself. Go to fed.gov and see if you can find the owners of the Federal Reserve Bank. I guarantee you can't. So here's a pretty easy to understand chart here. Adjusted gross income along the left here. Different groups here, share of all returns filed, share of all paid income taxes, and an average effective tax rate. So you can see those earning $2 million or more represent 0.1% of all returns filed. Okay, that makes sense, right? There are very few people earning $2 million or more. Share of all paid income taxes. Those people making $2 million or more are paying 20.4% of income taxes. The average effective tax rate on that particular group of people is 27.5%. Goes on down, 500,000 tax rate effective, 200,000. So most of us are going to be, I would guess, in this group here. Most people, right? So you also represent the highest share of returns filed and the lowest share of all paid income taxes. From 100,000 upward, so these are your two income earner professional families, let's say, they're going to be paying anywhere from 20 to 21%. You have better lawyers, better accountants and things in this tax bracket than you have in these subsequent tax brackets. So we have a progressive tax system. What I would advocate for would be a flat tax for everyone, 10%, 15%. I disagree with taxation on principle, but if we're going to have it and we can figure out efficient ways to care for the people we're trying to care for, I don't think the state is able to do that personally, but I think most people would believe that is fair if everyone is paying the same percentage of their income. We differ, like no one understands this system, right? Very few people do, even I would suspect few tax professionals even understand this. So what does this mean? We have an ever-increasing tax burden as a result of the importation of people who cannot compete in our economy. That's a problem. Those people typically vote for increased redistribution. What does that mean? They're going to vote to take more money from the middle class and redistribute it to the lower classes. At the same time, they are going to be consuming welfare benefits at a higher rate as a proportion of their population than the native population, while voting to take more, right? So you have a shrinking middle class with a growing burden, a growing tax burden on an ever decreasing percentage of the population. What happens, right? So you look at France. Gilets jaunes, Gilet Jaune, or Yellow Jacket. Those protests are over something like a 30-cent tax hike on fuel that came on the back end of massive waves of third world migrants from Africa who are not assimilating to the culture, forming ghettos, forming these no-go zones, and consuming welfare benefits at higher rates than the native population. In the United States, legal immigrants, more than half, are still consuming welfare benefits after 10 years in the United States. And we like to say, oh, well, they're coming here to get jobs, they're coming here for freedom, for opportunity, etc. Yes, many of them are, probably most of them are, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to compete in an ever increasingly sophisticated, technologically advanced Western society. When you're coming from Somalia, I mentioned in one of the last videos the disparity between first world and third world nations, the difference in mentality, the difference in the level of freedom, the difference in economic mobility. What we're creating is the recipe for a civil war, and that civil war is going to begin as an austerity protest by the middle class, this shrinking middle class that is seeing more of its income taken and redistributed while others are consuming those benefits. And not just that, the nation can only print so much before you get what's called a hyperinflation of the currency. You're expanding the amount of dollars in circulation on very little productivity. So take that for what it's worth. I think we need to look at data when we're talking about the future of the nation and when we're talking about policy objectives. So Hart-Celler, Islam, shrinking middle class, all of these things are a recipe for disaster in the near to medium term future. Hope you guys have a good one. We'll see you.